Americans like to believe they are emotionally free, open, honest, direct. But that belief didn't come from history. It came from hope. Because if you look closely, not at speeches or slogans, but at living rooms, family dinners, marriages, and quiet moments, you'll notice something else. Americans don't explode with emotion. They restrain it. They manage it. They hide it. And they didn't learn that naturally. They were taught. Not by modern society, not by technology, not by politics, but by a culture that crossed the Atlantic quietly in the 19th century, Victorian England. This is not a story about dresses, manners, or teacups. This is a story about emotional discipline, about restraint, about learning generation after generation that showing too much feeling was dangerous. And once you see how this happened, you'll understand something deeply personal. Why so many Americans struggle to say what they really feel. Stay with me until the end, because the final insight explains not just history, but family patterns many people still live with today. Victorian England was not loud. It did not rule through shouting or chaos. It ruled through control. And the most important thing it controlled was emotion. In Victorian society, feelings were not trusted. They were seen as wild, unreliable, dangerous, especially in women, but eventually in everyone. A respectable person did not display pain openly. They endured it. A respectable person did not speak anger freely. They swallowed it. A respectable person did not cry in public. They composed themselves. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was survival. Victorian life was harsh. Death was common. Disease was everywhere. Work was exhausting. Security was fragile. Emotion, they believed, weakened discipline. So they trained themselves and their children to control it. When millions of Victorians immigrated to America, they brought that belief with them. Not in books, not in laws, but in behavior. If this kind of deep historical storytelling matters to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep long-form history live for people who still care about understanding where we came from. America didn't reject Victorian emotional discipline. It adopted it, quietly. Early American homes became places of emotional performance. Children were taught early. Don't cry too long. Don't talk back. Don't show anger. Don't embarrass the family. Notice something important here. These weren't political rules. They were moral rules. And moral rules are harder to break because breaking them feels like becoming a bad person. Victorian parents believed emotional control was a virtue. American parents passed that belief on, even when they no longer knew its origin. By the early 20th century, Americans didn't say, "This is how Victorians behaved." They said, "This is how respectable people behave." Emotion became something private, contained, hidden behind politeness. This shaped American masculinity profoundly. Men were taught that strong emotion was weakness. A man who cried was unstable. A man who spoke about fear was unmanly. A man who admitted emotional pain was failing. Where did that come from? Victorian England. Victorian fathers believed stoicism built character. American fathers passed that stoicism down, often without realizing why. And women learned a different lesson. They learned to manage everyone else's emotions while suppressing their own. A good woman was calm, supportive, understanding, never too demanding, never too emotional. If she was overwhelmed, she kept it to herself. If she was unhappy, she softened it. If she was angry, she reframed it. This wasn't submission. It was training. Training that made families function. but at a cost. And that cost was emotional honesty. If you're finding yourself recognizing family patterns in this story, share this video with someone who grew up the same way. These conversations matter more than people realize. American society praised emotional strength, but defined strength as silence. Think about funerals. Think about family crises. Think about moments of deep loss. How often were people told, "Be strong, don't fall apart, hold it together"? That language is Victorian. It doesn't mean Americans didn't feel deeply. They did. They just learned not to show it. Over time, this created a culture where emotions existed, but were poorly spoken. People felt sadness, but didn't name it. Felt resentment, but didn't confront it. Felt fear, but masked it as irritation or withdrawal. This is why so many Americans struggle with emotional communication. Not because they lack feeling, but because they inherited a system that never taught them how to express it safely. Victorian England taught emotional control as survival. America inherited emotional silence as normalcy. And here's where it gets even more interesting. When psychology and self-help entered American culture in the 20th century, they clashed directly with Victorian emotional discipline. Suddenly, people were told to talk about feelings, to express pain, to open up.
But generations raised on restraint didn't know how. So they intellectualized emotion instead of feeling it. They joked instead of crying. They worked instead of grieving. And many passed that confusion down to their children. If you're still watching, you're part of a smaller group that understands something important. History doesn't live in museums. It lives in habits. Consider subscribing if you value this kind of depth. Victorian emotional discipline also shaped American public life. Politeness became a shield. Small talk replaced truth. Conflict was avoided, not resolved. People learned to smile while uncomfortable, to agree while resentful, to endure while disconnected. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was conditioning. And it worked for a time. It built stable communities, predictable behavior, social order. But it also created emotional loneliness. People lived surrounded by others, yet felt unseen. And they often didn't know why. Because when emotional silence becomes cultural, people stop recognizing it as silence. They think it's just how things are. This is why the title matters. Victorians didn't just teach Americans manners. They taught them emotional containment. They taught them to feel quietly. And they taught them that too much emotion was something to be ashamed of. Before we reach the final and most revealing part of this story, take a moment to like this video if it's giving you a new perspective. It helps more people discover history that actually explains their lives. What happens next, how this legacy shaped modern relationships, parenting, and emotional health, is where everything comes together. Marriage was where Victorian emotional discipline did its quietest work and its deepest damage. In Victorian culture, marriage was not designed to be emotionally expressive. It was designed to be stable, functional, respectable. Love was assumed, not discussed. Affection was shown through duty, not words. Problems were endured, not explored. When that model crossed into American life, it didn't arrive as a rule book. It arrived as expectation. Husbands were expected to provide, not process. Wives were expected to manage the emotional atmosphere of the home without disturbing it. Difficult feelings were seen as failures of character rather than signals of unmet needs. So couples learned to coexist instead of connect. Arguments were softened into silence. Hurt was transformed into politeness. Resentment learned to wear the mask of routine. And because everyone around them lived the same way, it felt normal. Children grew up watching marriages that looked stable from the outside, but emotionally distant on the inside. They learned that love meant reliability, not vulnerability. That commitment meant endurance, not honesty.
and they carried that lesson forward. This is one reason emotional conversations feel so uncomfortable for many Americans today, not because they don't care, but because they were never shown how care is spoken out loud. Victorian emotional restraint didn't vanish with time, it evolved. By the mid-20th century, America celebrated optimism, smiling families, clean homes, cheerful advertisements. Happiness became a public performance. But sadness, anger, fear, those were private failures. People learned to keep the house clean and the heart quiet. If you think about it, this explains why so many Americans are comfortable talking about success, but uncomfortable talking about pain. Why achievement is praised, but emotional struggle is hidden behind phrases like, "I'm fine," or "it's nothing."